morning, you might open your Bibles to Deuteronomy 8. Deuteronomy 8 will be our main passage for this morning. It is good to see you and glad that we can have this time to spend together, especially with so many who are visiting with us and so many who are back with us that have been out for whatever reason, and we're back together now. What a blessing it is to be together. I suppose that many of you have had the same experience that I've had this week of being full, and there was a sign in town on one of the church buildings that said, are you going to be grateful or just full? And I know I have been full, and hopefully I have been grateful and thankful. And that's really in line with what I want to think about this morning. We've been talking over the last several weeks as I've had an opportunity to preach from the book of Deuteronomy, chapters 4 through 11 especially, and thinking about fundamentals of faithfulness. And I've been making the case that in these chapters, Moses is not talking as much about the specifics of following the Old Covenant law, but rather he's been talking about those core fundamental principles that stand behind that. And I want to think about the principles, and we've been thinking about, as Moses makes the case here in the book of Deuteronomy, this is what God has done for us, this is what God expects of us, and this is what God will do for us. And as we live under the new covenant, there are expectations that God has of us. But I don't think the fundamental principles have changed. He still wants us to hear Him, and to fear Him, and to love Him, and to serve Him, and to hold fast to Him, even though some of the specifics may have changed here and there. And so the case that I want to make again this morning is that because what God has called us to is very similar to what He called Israel to, the dangers are similar too. The threats to our faithfulness are similar. Last time we talked about the danger of idolatry. And while that danger may look different in our day and in our age, we may not be building marble or golden statues and bowing down before them, but though that's not that far removed from many places in the world, even in our current day. We still have those idols that we set up, and we look to, and we trust them, and we love them, and we obey them. And we have to be careful, even as Israel was careful. But I want to think about a different danger this morning, a different threat to our faithfulness that Moses instructs the people in here in Deuteronomy chapter 8. And I'd like to begin by looking at the first 6 verses of this chapter. Moses says, "All the commandments which I command you this day you shall observe to do, that you may live and multiply and go in and possess the land which the Lord sware unto your fathers. And you shall remember all the way which the Lord thy God hath led thee these 40 years in the wilderness, to humble thee and to prove thee, to know what was in thy heart, whether thou wouldest keep His commandments or no. And He humbled thee, and suffered thee to hunger, and fed thee with manna which thou knewest not, neither did thy fathers know, that He might make thee know that man doth not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceedeth out of the mouth of the Lord doth man live. Thy raiment waxed not old upon thee, neither did thy foot swell these 40 years. Thou shalt also consider in thine heart, that as a man chasteneth his son, so the Lord thy God chasteneth thee. Therefore thou shalt keep the commandments of the Lord thy God, to walk in His ways, and to fear Him." Here in chapter 8, again, Moses reiterates the need for them to obey and observe and keep the instructions. And in addition to that, and really maybe even bolstering that instruction, in support of that, he says you need to remember the wilderness lessons. Well, what was God teaching Israel in the wilderness? What were the wilderness lessons? Look at verse 2. He says, one of the reasons God had you in the wilderness was to humble you and to test you, to see if you would keep His commandments or not. He says in verse 3 that it was to teach them that they needed more than bread to survive. They needed God and they needed His Word in order to really live. And in verse 5, it was for discipline. And oftentimes we think of discipline only in the sense of corrective punishment. But here the sense is of training, of nurturing in the sense of being able to guide and to mold and to shape as they move forward. And so the wilderness lessons was for their testing, for their training, and for their teaching. And all of that teaching and training and testing was with a focus on trusting God so that they could obey Him. The wilderness was intended to teach them, to test them, and to train them so that they would trust God and obey Him. In the wilderness, God allowed them to be hungry. They didn't have access to new clothes and shoes all the time. But God provided them with manna from heaven, and He kept their clothes where they wouldn't wear out. Why? Because God was testing, and He was teaching, and He was training them. They needed to learn that fundamentally, really, truly, and ultimately, they depended on God to sustain them, and that if they were going to survive, they were going to have to listen to Him. So consider the example of the manna, and for that we need to flip back to Exodus chapter 16. And we won't read the whole text here, but I want you just to look at the text and be reminded of some things. So in Exodus chapter 16, really beginning at verse 16, Moses gives the instructions and says that this is what God commanded, that you go out and you gather this amount, the amount you need for each day, and then you take it back to your tent. And so when they do that, verses 17 and following, the people who gather too much, they have exactly the amount they were supposed to. And the people who gathered too little, they have exactly the amount that they were supposed to. Now, verse 19, Moses says, don't keep it till the morning. Verse 20, notwithstanding, they hearkened not unto Moses, but some of them left of it until the morning, and it bred worms and stank, and Moses was wroth with them. So they try to keep it over to the next day, and it rots and stinks, and it's useless. And so, verse 21, and they gathered it every morning, and every man according to his eating, and when the sun waxed hot, it melted. Now, in verses 22 and following, we learned that what the people do on the sixth day is they gather twice as much so that they can be ready for the Sabbath day the next day. They know they're not supposed to be going out and doing any work on the Sabbath day, and so they don't gather on the Sabbath. And some of the elders are actually angry with this. Why are they getting twice as much? As Moses says, this is the right thing for them to do. This was appropriate so that they don't go out and gather it. But notice this, that in verse 27, and it came to pass that there were some of them who went out on the seventh day to gather, and they found none. There was none provided there. And the Lord said unto Moses, how long refuse ye to keep my commandments and my laws? See, for that the Lord hath given you the Sabbath, therefore He giveth you on the sixth day the bread of 2 days. Abide ye every man in his tent, let no man go out of his place on the seventh day. So the people rested on the seventh day. Now, I want you to notice some things here. God provided this manna for them. They had never seen anything like it before. In fact, the word manna means something like, what is it? They looked at it, what is it? They had to go out and get it. But they could only get enough for 1 day. And of course, the exception was on that 6th day in preparation for the Sabbath. When they tried to store it, it didn't work. So everybody had to go out every day and pick up the manna that fell from heaven. What was that teaching them? First, they had to trust God. They didn't have a choice. In the wilderness, it was trust God's provision or die. Those were the options. That was it. They were learning to depend on God in the wilderness. It could not have been more obvious that He was the one providing for them. And there were not other sources of food, and so if they weren't going to get the manna that fell from heaven, they weren't going to get any food at all. And their desperation taught them they had to trust God if they were going to survive. Second, this was a training ground for teaching them, you've got to obey God. And so He was training, He put up guardrails. He put up lines and boundaries and limits so that they had to obey Him every day. And when they didn't obey Him, it didn't work out for them. And what God is saying is, if you don't obey me, it's not going to work, right? So when they try to keep it overnight, what happens? It gets worms and it rots. So they didn't obey God, but they learned pretty quickly that we better obey God or it's not going to work out. When they went out on the 7th day to collect, God didn't send out any manna. So He didn't give them the freedom, He didn't give them the option really of disobeying Him on that day. Those were the training wheels. Those were the boundaries. They were the limits that He put because He's teaching them. You got to trust me. You're not going to get food otherwise. And you've got to obey me. It's not going to work out for you otherwise. And if God could provide the very basics of their sustenance, then they should have learned that they could trust Him and should obey Him. Because God had promised that He would take care of them and as His special people. And in seeing that need met with regards to food, they should have understood the only way we're going to survive is if God tells us what to do, if God gives us promises and hope, and if we trust and obey Him. That's how they would live. Those were the wilderness lessons. Let's go back to Deuteronomy chapter 8. Deuteronomy chapter 8 and pick up at verse 7. So remember the wilderness lessons Moses tells them. Then picking up at verse 7 of Deuteronomy 8. For the Lord thy God bringeth thee into a good land, a land of brooks, of water, of fountains and depths that spring out of valleys and hills, a land of wheat and barley and vines and fig trees and pomegranates, a land of oil, olive, and honey, a land wherein thou shalt eat bread without scarceness, thou shalt not lack anything in it, a land whose stones are iron, and out of whose hills thou mayst dig brass. When thou hast eaten and art full, then thou shalt bless the Lord thy God for the good land which he hath given thee. Beware that thou forget not the Lord thy God in keeping his commandments and his judgments and his statutes which I command thee this day, lest when thou hast eaten and art full and hast built goodly houses and dwelt therein, and when thy herds, thy flocks multiply, and thy silver and thy gold is multiplied, and all that thou hast is multiplied, then thy heart be lifted up, and thou forget the Lord thy God who brought thee forth out of the land of Egypt from the house of bondage, who led thee through that great and terrible wilderness, wherein were fiery serpents and scorpions and drought, where there was no water, who brought thee forth water out of the rock of flint, who fed thee in the wilderness with manna, which thy fathers knew not, that he might humble thee, and that he might prove thee to do thee good at thy latter end. And thou say in thy heart, my power and the might of mine hand hath gotten me this wealth. But thou shalt remember the Lord thy God. For it is he that giveth thee power to get wealth, that he may establish his covenant which he sware unto thy fathers as it is this day. And it shall be, if thou do at all forget the Lord thy God, and walk after other gods, and serve them, and worship them, I testify you this day, that ye shall surely perish. As the nations which the Lord destroyeth before your face, so shall ye perish, because ye would not be obedient unto the voice of the Lord your God. They needed to remember the wilderness lessons. They needed to remember that they depended entirely upon God's provision, because they were about to be in a place where they were not going to get those clear daily reminders of how much they depended on God. They were about to be in a place where they could store and multiply and build wealth, and in the midst of all that, they would be in a place, unlike the wilderness, where they could very easily forget where it all came from. Many of these things they didn't even build. Right? So Lonnie read for us from Deuteronomy chapter 6. He says you're going to go in and there's going to be houses you didn't build, and fields you didn't plant, and wells you didn't dig. Don't forget who gave it to you. But even the things that they did produce, even the things that they did build, where did that come from? Look again at verse 18. You shall remember the Lord your God, for it is He that giveth thee the power to get wealth, that He may establish His covenant. And so even their strength and their power and their ability, sure they had to work for the things they had, but their power and the increase of their produce, that came from God. Now what was the proper response to these gifts? Look at verse 10. When you have eaten and you're full, you shall bless the Lord your God for the good things He hath given thee. They were to give thanks. They were to remember who it came from. They were to remember the source of those gifts. God meant this to be a blessing to them, and that they should turn again and give Him a blessing, to speak well of Him. But what could happen? Verses 19 and 20. What God meant for a blessing could become a curse. They could take all the things that God had blessed them with, and they could forget Him and turn and serve other gods, and then they would be cursed just like the people that were in the land. They could take what God meant for a blessing, and it would be a curse. It is possible that abundance, success, security, and comfort could cause us to forget the lessons that we learn when we're in need. It is possible for prosperity to erase from our minds the lessons that desperation taught us. It's a real danger. Remember the fundamental admonition through this text. Chapter 8, verse 1. Observe and do the commandments. Verse 6. Do the commandments. Keep the commandments of the Lord. Verse 11. Keep His commandments, His judgments, His statutes, which I command you. Verse 20, be obedient to the voice of the Lord your God. The fundamental instruction here is to be obedient. In the wilderness, God tested, taught, and trained them in obedience. But now the training wheels are coming off. Would their newfound freedom, the blessing of not having to go out and gather every day, and it was a blessing. It was a blessing to not have to go out on Monday and gather. and then not have enough for Tuesday, and then go. It was a blessing to not have to do that. But with that blessing was a tremendous danger. See, what Israel needed to understand is that whether they were in the wilderness picking up manna off the ground that fell from heaven, or if they're in the land eating from flocks and vineyards and fields that they didn't plant, or harvesting the bounty of a successful crop year, they still totally depended on God's provision. They needed to learn that lesson in the wilderness and remember it in the land. They didn't have anything without God. In the wilderness, if they trusted and obeyed God, what happened? He provided. If they didn't, they'd starve. You don't trust and obey God in the wilderness? There's no other option here. In the land, how was it any different? It really wasn't. Right? So the consequences were not as immediate. But they have herds, and they have fields, and they have storehouses and wealth. They could get by for a while, they think. But ultimately, if they don't trust and obey God, they still die. They still die. In the wilderness or in the land. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that they're in a land of milk and honey. It doesn't matter that they're in a land of abundance. If they don't trust and obey God, they still die. Man cannot live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. Consider this threat to faithfulness. Forgetfulness in the face of abundance. If there was ever an age where this danger existed, this is the age. Even with inflation, even with supply chain crises. Right? I went to the store the other day, and they had probably half the chips that they normally have. I found the chips I wanted, but I came back to the buggy and told them, they ain't got nothing, right? Man, how spoiled am I that still having the chips I wanted and 20 or 30 different other options, and I say, they ain't got nothing, right? They had a lot that I didn't even want. That cheese puffs. Ugh. Anyway, okay. Wealth and abundance are great blessings. God intends them to be so. He did not call upon Israel to burn all of the blessings when they make it into the land. He does not call upon them to reject wealth or reject riches or live in abject poverty. He does not call them to that. What He calls them to is obey Him even when they have plenty. And He tells them here in Deuteronomy chapter 8 that the great danger of wealth, the great danger of success, the great danger of comfort is that we will forget that we depend every moment on God and His provision. What does He call upon them to do in the face of prosperity? Listen and obey God's instructions. Does God want us to get rid of our possessions? I don't think so. I don't think that's what the Scriptures teach. But He wants us to use those things, giving thanks to Him, trusting Him, always obeying Him, and ultimately looking forward to what's eternal. Just a couple of passages, and the lesson will be yours. I know that seems strange this early on in the service, but normally it's a lot later when I say that. Luke chapter 12, beginning at verse 13. Here is Jesus teaching. In the context, verse 13, one of the company said unto Him, Master, speak to my brother that he divide the inheritance with me. And He said, Man, who made me a judge over, or a divider over you? Verse 15, He tells a parable. He said unto them, Take heed and beware of covetousness. For a man's life does not consist in the abundance of the things which he possesseth. That is, man shall not live by bread alone. Right? Our life doesn't consist in the things we possess. Verse 16, And He spake a parable unto them, saying, The ground of a certain rich man brought forth plentifully. And he thought within himself, What shall I do, because I have no room where to bestow my fruits? Then he said, This I will do. I will pull down my barns and build greater, and there will I bestow all my fruits and my goods. And I will say to my soul, Soul, thou hast much goods laid up for many years. Take thine ease, eat, drink, and be merry. But God said unto him, Thou fool, this night thy soul shall be required of thee. Then who shall those things be which thou hast provided? And so is he that layeth up treasure for himself, and is not rich towards God. The rich man's problem was not being rich. The rich man's problem is that he wasn't rich enough. He was rich in the wrong things. He was rich in this world's good and was not rich towards God. He made no provision for the spiritual nature of his life. He made no provision for eternity. He did not trust God. He did not obey God. He did not use his wealth to glorify God. He did not remember God in this. Think about the personal pronouns that are used here. I, me, myself, mine. Never does he remember what Moses told the people of Israel not to forget. This Israelite got into a land where he had plenty and he forgot where it came from. And Jesus says that man's soul is going to be required of him. Then who will this belong to? See, man doesn't live by bread alone, because bread will only do you good for the time you're here. Then what? And then you better be rich towards God. And so Paul gives an instruction in 1 Timothy chapter 6 and verse 17. 1 Timothy chapter 6 and verse 17. He's telling Timothy about how to teach those who are rich in this present age, which includes just about all of us. We're in the top 1% of world wealth. Almost everybody in here, I would assume. So, charge them, this is verse 17, charge them that are rich in this world that they be not high-minded, nor trust in uncertain riches, but in the living God who giveth us richly all things to enjoy. We need to learn the wilderness lesson. That we cannot put our trust in the wealth and in the riches, but we have to put our trust in the God who gives those things to us. Why does He give them to us? So that we can enjoy them. But also, verse 18, so that we can do good with them. That they do good, that they be rich in good works, ready to distribute, willing to communicate, laying up in store for themselves a good foundation against the time to come, that they may lay hold of eternal life. Few of us have experienced the desperation of the wilderness. We have not learned the lesson of dependence on God in the same way that they had to learn that lesson. But we can get our education on their dime. We can learn that lesson in the midst of abundance if we're willing to listen to it. If we will remember that many of us live in houses we didn't build, and we eat from food that maybe our own power and our own strength provided, but where did that power and strength come from? If we will remember that, the call to us is to trust God, to obey Him, to be rich towards Him, to lay hold of eternal life, and not let comfort and success and abundance and riches and security and plenty numb us to our desperate condition outside of Christ. And numb us to the realization that we are desperate to have God's instruction about how to take our next step without dying in the ways that really matter, without spiritually dying. It is a truth that riches and comfort and abundance keep us from seeing how desperately we need God's Word and how desperate we are for His instruction. Well, I'm not out of notes, but I'm going to stop because I think that's a good place to leave off. If you're here and you have realized your soul's condition and how desperately you need the forgiveness that God offers, this is a wonderful opportunity to refocus and remember what God has blessed us with. We have spent a week, hopefully, giving thanks. Let's demonstrate how thankful we are to God by keeping and observing the commandments He's given us. That was the instruction Moses gave them. How do we show God that we remember that He's the one who blesses us? We do what He tells us, because that shows Him that we trust Him. He's testing us. We've sung songs about us being pilgrims. We're in our own wilderness. He's testing us. He's proving us. He's training us. He's teaching us. And the lesson He's teaching us is you don't live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from His mouth. If the gospel invitation is applicable to you, if you need God's forgiveness, then take advantage of it today while we stand and while we sing.
Thanks for watching. If you found this video to be beneficial, please follow us on Facebook or subscribe to our YouTube channel. Feel free to share it with others that you feel like may benefit from it. If you need to contact us, please contact us via email at quinn.church@yahoo.com. Also, if you're in the area, we would love for you to come visit with us at one of our assemblies. Have a good day.